Empire, Chapter 4.2, Generation and Corruption. From Empire, by Michael Hardt and Antonio Negri. Quote, "You cannot spill a drop of American blood without spilling the blood of the whole world. Our blood is as the flood of the Amazon, made up of 1,000 noble currents, all pouring into one. We are not a nation, so much as a world. For unless we may claim all the world for our sire, like Melchizedek, we are without mother or father. Our ancestry is lost in the universal paternity. We are the heirs of all time, and with all nations we divide our inheritance." End quote, by Herman Melville. Quote, "Fate has willed it that America is from now on to be at the center of Western civilization rather than on the periphery." End quote, by Walter Lippmann. Quote, "There is no escaping American business." End quote, by Louis Ferdinand Céline. The theory of the constitution of empire is also a theory of its decline, as European theorists of empire have recognized for the last several thousand years. Already in Greco-Roman antiquity, Thucydides, Tacitus, and Polybius all recounted the sequence of rise and fall, as did later the fathers of the church and the theorists of early Christianity. In none of these cases, when speaking of empire, was it simply a matter for them of repeating the classical theory of the alternation between positive and negative forms of government, because empire by definition goes beyond this alternation. The internal crisis of the concept of empire, however, became completely clear only in the Enlightenment period and the period of the construction of European modernity, when authors such as Montesquieu and Gibbon made the problem of the decadence of the Roman Empire one of the central topics of the analysis of the political forms of the modern sovereign state. Rise and fall, Machiavelli. In classical antiquity, the concept of empire already presupposed crisis. Empire was conceived in the framework of a naturalist theory of the forms of government, and even though it breaks a cyclical alternation of good and bad forms, it is not exempt from the destiny of the corruption of the city and civilization as a whole. History is dominated by psyche, fortune or destiny, which at times inevitably ruins the perfection that empire achieves. From Thucydides to Tacitus, and from Athens to Rome, the necessary equilibrium between the forms of common life and command was situated in this linear destiny. Polybius' analyses of the Roman Empire broke with this conception of the cyclical character of historical development, whereby the human construction of the political constantly shifts from the good to the bad forms of the city and power, from monarchy to tyranny, from aristocracy to oligarchy, and from democracy to anarchy, and then eventually begins a new cycle. Polybius claimed that the Roman Empire broke with this cycle by creating a synthesis of the good forms of power. Empire is thus understood not so much as the rule over universal space and time, but rather as a movement that gathers together the spaces and the temporalities through the powers of the social forces that seek to liberate themselves from the natural cyclical character of the time of history. Surpassing the line of destiny, however, is aleatory. The synthesis of the good forms of government, the government of civic virtue, can defy destiny but cannot replace it. Crisis and decline are determinations that every day must be overcome. During the European Enlightenment, authors such as Montesquieu and Gibbon rejected the naturalist conception of this process. The decline of empire was explained in social scientific terms. As a result of the impossibility of making last the historical and social constructions of the multitude and the virtue of its heroes. The corruption and decline of empire were thus not a natural presupposition, determined by the cyclical destiny of history, but rather a product of the human impossibility, or at least the extreme difficulty of governing an unlimited space and time. The limitlessness of empire undermined the capacity to make the good institutions function and last. Nonetheless, empire was an end toward which the desire and the civic virtue of the multitude and its human capacities to make history all tended. It was a precarious situation that could not support unbounded space and time, but instead ineluctably limited the universal aims of government to finite political and social dimensions. The Enlightenment authors told us that the government that approximates perfection will be constructed with moderation across limited space and time. Between empire and the reality of command, therefore, there was a contradiction in principle that would inevitably spawn crises. Machiavelli, looking back at the conception of the ancients and anticipating that of the moderns, is really the one who offers us the most adequate illustration of the paradox of empire. He clarified the problematic by separating it from both the naturalizing terrain of the ancients and the sociological terrain of the moderns, presenting it rather on the field of immanence and pure politics. In Machiavelli, expansive government is pushed forward by the dialectic of the social and political forces of the Republic. Only where the social classes and their political expressions are posed in an open and continuous play of counterpower are freedom and expansion linked together. And hence, only there does empire become possible. There is no concept of empire, Machiavelli says, that is not a decisively expansive concept of freedom. Precisely in this dialectic of freedom, then, is where the elements of corruption and destruction reside. When Machiavelli discusses the fall of the Roman Empire, he focuses first and foremost on the crisis of civil religion, or really, on the decline of the social relation that had unified the different ideological social forces and allowed them to participate together in the open interaction of counterpowers. Christian religion is what destroyed the Roman Empire by destroying the civic passion that pagan society had sustained, the conflictual but loyal participation of the citizens, and the continuous perfecting of the constitution and the process of freedom. The ancient notion of the necessary and natural corruption of the good forms of government is thus radically displaced because it can be evaluated only in relation to the social and political relationship that organized the Constitution. The Enlightenment and modern notion of the crisis of unbounded and uncontrollable space and time is similarly displaced because it too was led back to the realm of civic power. On this and no other basis can space and time be evaluated. The alternative is thus not between government and corruption, or between empire and decline, but between, on the one hand, socially rooted and expansive government, that is, civic and democratic government, and on the other, every practice of government that grounds its own power in transcendence and repression. We should be clear here that when we speak of the city or democracy in quotation marks as the basis for the expansive activity of the Republic, and as the only possibility for a lasting empire, we are introducing a concept of participation that is linked to the vitality of a population and to its capacity to generate a dialectic of counterpowers. A concept, therefore, that has little to do with the classical or the modern concept of democracy. Even the reigns of Genghis Khan and Tamerlane were from this perspective somewhat democratic, as were Caesar's legions, Napoleon's armies, and the armies of Stalin and Eisenhower, since each of them enabled the participation of a population that supported its expansive action. What is central in all these cases, and in the general concept of empire, is that a terrain of immanence be affirmed. Immanence is defined as the absence of every external limit from the trajectories of the action of the multitude, and immanence is tied only, in its affirmations and destructions, to regimes of possibility that constitute its formation and development. Here we find ourselves back at the center of the paradox by which every theory of empire concedes the possibility of its own decline. But now we can begin to explain it. If empire is always an absolute positivity, the realization of a government of the multitude, and an absolutely immanent apparatus, then it is exposed to crisis precisely on the terrain of this definition, and not for any other necessity or transcendence opposed to it. Crisis is the sign of an alternative possibility on the plane of immanence, a crisis that is not necessary but always possible. Machiavelli helps us understand this immanent, constitutive, and ontological sense of crisis. Only in the present situation, however, does this coexistence of crisis and the field of immanence become completely clear. Since the spatial and temporal dimensions of political action are no longer the limits, but the constructive mechanisms of imperial government, the coexistence of the positive and the negative on the terrain of immanence is now configured as an open alternative. Today, The same movements and tendencies constitute both the rise and the decline of empire. Finis Europae, Wittgenstein. The coexistence of the imperial spirit with signs of crisis and decline has appeared in many different guises in European discourse over the past 2 centuries, often as a reflection either on the end of European hegemony or on the crisis of democracy and the triumph of mass society. We have insisted at length throughout this book that the modern governments of Europe developed not imperial, but imperialist forms. The concept of empire nonetheless survived in Europe, and its lack of reality was continually mourned. The European debates about empire and decline interest us for 2 primary reasons. First, because the crisis of the ideal of imperial Europe is at the center of these debates, and second, because this crisis strikes precisely in that secret place of the definition of empire where the concept of democracy resides. Another element that we have to keep in mind here is the standpoint from which the debates were conducted, a standpoint that adopts the historical drama of the decline of empire in terms of collective lived experience. The theme of the crisis of Europe was translated into a discourse on the decline of empire and linked to the crisis of democracy, along with the forms of consciousness and resistance that this crisis implies. Alexis de Tocqueville was perhaps the first to present the problem in these terms. His analysis of mass democracy in the United States, with its spirit of initiative and expansion, led him to the bitter and prophetic recognition of the impossibility for European elites to continue to maintain a position of command over world civilization. Hegel had already perceived something very similar. Quote, "America is the country of the future, and its world historical importance has yet to be revealed in the ages which lie ahead. It is a land of desire for all those who are weary of the historical arsenal of old Europe." End quote. Tocqueville, however, understood this passage in a much more profound way. The reason for the crisis of European civilization and its imperial practices consists in the fact that European virtue, or really its aristocratic morality, organized in the institutions of modern sovereignty, cannot manage to keep pace with the vital powers of mass democracy. The death of God that many Europeans began to perceive was really a sign of the expiration of their own planetary centrality, which they could understand only in terms of a modern mysticism. From Nietzsche to Burckhardt, from Thomas Mann to Max Weber, from Spengler to Heidegger and Ortega y Gasset, and numerous other authors who straddled the 19th and 20th centuries, this intuition became a constant refrain that was sung with such bitterness. The appearance of the masses in the social and political scene, the exhaustion of the cultural and productive models of modernity, the waning of the European imperialist projects, and the conflicts among nations on question of scarcity, poverty, and class struggle, all these emerged as irreversible signs of decline. Nihilism dominated the era because the times were without hope. Nietzsche gave the definitive diagnosis: Europe is sick. The 2 world wars that would ravage its territories, the triumph of fascism, and now, after the collapse of Stalinism, the reappearance of the most terrible specters of nationalism and intolerance, all stand as proof to confirm that these intuitions were in fact correct. From our standpoint, however, the fact that against the old powers of Europe, a new empire has formed is only good news. Who wants to see any more of that pallid and parasitic European ruling class that led directly from the ancient regime to nationalism, from populism to fascism, and now pushes for a generalized neoliberalism? Who wants to see more of those ideologies and those bureaucratic apparatuses that have nourished and abetted the rotting European elites? And who can still stand those systems of labor organization and those corporations that have stripped away every vital spirit? Our task here is not to lament the crisis of Europe, but rather to recognize in its analyses the elements that, while confirming its tendency, still indicate possible resistances, the margins of positive reaction, and the alternatives of destiny. These elements have often appeared almost against the will of the theorists of the crisis of their own times. It is a resistance that leads to a future time, a real and proper future past, a kind of future perfect tense. In this sense, through the painful analyses of its causes, the crisis of European ideology can reveal the definition of new, open resources. This is why it is important to follow the developments of the crisis of Europe, because not only in authors such as Nietzsche and Weber, but also in the public opinion of the times, the denunciation of the crisis revealed an extremely powerful positive side, which contained the fundamental characteristics of the New World Empire we are entering today. The agents of the crisis of the old imperial world became foundations of the new. The undifferentiated mass that by its simple presence was able to destroy the modern tradition and its transcendent power appears now as a powerful productive force and an uncontainable source of valorization. A new vitality, almost like the barbaric forces that buried Rome, reanimates the field of imminence that the death of the European god left us as our horizon. Every theory of the crisis of European man and of the decline of the idea of European empire is in some way a symptom of the new vital force of the masses, or as we prefer, of the desire of the multitude. Nietzsche declared this from the mountaintops. Quote, "I have absorbed in myself the spirit of Europe. Now I want to strike back." End quote. Going beyond modernity means going beyond the barriers and transcendences of Eurocentrism, and leads toward the definitive adoption of the field of immanence as the exclusive terrain of the theory and practice of politics. In the years after the explosion of the First World War, those who had participated in the Great Massacre tried desperately to understand and control the crisis. Consider the testimonies of Franz Rosenzweig and Walter Benjamin. For both of them, a kind of secular eschatology was the mechanism by which the experience of the crisis could be set free. After the historical experience of war and misery, and also perhaps with an intuition of the Holocaust to come, they tried to discover a hope and a light of redemption. This attempt, however, did not succeed in escaping the powerful undertow of the dialectic. Certainly, the dialectic, that cursed dialectic that had held together and anointed European values, had been emptied out from within. It was now defined in completely negative terms. The apocalyptic scene on which this mysticism searched for liberation and redemption, however, was still too implicated in the crisis. Benjamin recognized this bitterly. Quote, "The past carries with it a temporal index by which it is referred to redemption. There is a secret agreement between past generations and the present. Our coming is expected on earth. Like every generation that preceded us, we have been endowed with a weak messianic power, a power to which the past has claim." End quote. This theoretical experience arose precisely when the crisis of modernity appeared with the most intensity. On this same terrain, other authors sought to break the remnants of the dialectic and its powers of subsumption. It seems to us, however, that even the strongest thinkers of the day were not able to break with the dialectic in the crisis. In Max Weber, the crisis of sovereignty and legitimacy can be resolved only through recourse to the irrational figures of charisma. In Carl Schmitt, the horizon of sovereign practices can be cleared only by recourse to the decision. An irrational dialectic, however, cannot resolve or even attenuate the crisis of reality, and the powerful shadow of an aestheticized dialectic slips even to Heidegger's notion of pastoral function over a scattered and fractured being. For the real clarification of the scene, we are most indebted to the series of French philosophers who reread Nietzsche several decades later, in the 1960s. Their rereading involved a reorientation of the standpoint of the critique, which came about when they began to recognize the end of the functioning of the dialectic, and when this recognition was confirmed in the new practical, political experiences that centered on the production of subjectivity. This was a production of subjectivity as power, as the constitution of an autonomy that could not be reduced to any abstract or transcendent synthesis. Not the dialectic, but refusal, resistance, violence, and the positive affirmation of being now marked the relationship between the location of the crisis and reality and the adequate response. What, in the midst of the crisis in the 1920s, appeared as transcendence against history, redemption against corruption, and messianism against nihilism, now was constructed as an ontologically definite position outside and against, and thus beyond every possible residue of the dialectic. This was a new materialism which negated every transcendent element and constituted a radical reorientation of spirit. In order to understand the profundity of this passage, one would do well to focus on the awareness and anticipation of it in the thought of Ludwig Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein's early writings give a new life to the dominant themes of early 20th century European thought: the condition of the dwelling in the desert of sense and searching for meaning, the coexistence of a mysticism of the totality, and the ontological tendency toward the production of subjectivity. Contemporary history and its drama, which had been stripped away from any dialectic, were then removed by Wittgenstein from any contingency. History and experience became the scene of a materialist and tautological refoundation of the subject, in a desperate attempt to find coherence in the crisis. In the midst of World War I, Wittgenstein wrote, quote, "How things stand is God. God is how things stand. Only from the consciousness of the uniqueness of my life arises religion, science, and art." End quote. And further, quote, "This consciousness is life itself. Can it be an ethics even if there is no living being outside myself? Can there be any ethics if there is no living being but myself? If ethics is supposed to be something fundamental, there can. If I am right, then it is not sufficient for the ethical judgment that a world be given. Then the world in itself is neither good nor evil. Good and evil only enter through the subject, and the subject is not part of the world, but a boundary of the world." End quote. Wittgenstein denounces the god of war and the desert of things in which good and evil are now indistinguishable by situating the world on the limit of tautological subjectivity. Quote, "Here one can see that solipsism coincides with pure realism, if it is strictly thought out." End quote. This limit, however, is creative. The alternative is completely given when, and only when, subjectivity is posed outside the world. Quote, "My propositions serve as elucidations in the following way. Anyone who understands me eventually recognizes them as nonsensical. When he used them as steps to climb up and beyond them, he must, so to speak, throw away the ladder after he climbed up it. He must transcend these propositions, and then he will see the world aright." End quote. Wittgenstein recognizes the end of every possible dialectic, and any meaning that resides in the logic of the world and not in its marginal subjective surpassing. The tragic trajectory of this philosophical experience allows us to grasp those elements that made the perception of the crisis of modernity and the decline of the idea of Europe a negative but necessary condition of the definition of the coming empire. These authors are voices crying out in the desert. Part of this generation will be interned in extermination camps. Others would perpetuate the crisis through an illusory faith in Soviet modernization. Others still, a significant group of these authors, would flee to America. They were indeed voices crying out in the desert, but their rare and singular anticipations of life in the desert gave us the means to reflect on the possibilities and the multitude in the new reality of postmodern empire. Those authors were the first to define the condition of the complete deterritorialization of the coming empire, and they were situated in it just as the multitudes are situated in it today. The negativity, the refusal to participate, the discovery of an emptiness that invests everything. This means situating oneself peremptorily in an imperial reality that is itself defined by crisis. Empire is a desert, and crisis is, at this point, indistinguishable from the tendency of history. Whereas in the ancient world, the imperial crisis was conceived as the product of a natural cyclical history, and whereas in the modern world, crisis was defined by a series of aporias of time and space, now figures of crisis and practices of empire have become indistinguishable. The 20th century theorists of crisis teach us, however, that in this deterritorialized and untimely space, where the new empire is constructed, and in this desert of meaning, the testimony of the crisis can pass toward the realization of a singular and collective subject, toward the powers of the multitude. The multitude has internalized the lack of place and fixed time. It is mobile and flexible, and it conceives the future only as a totality of possibilities that branch out in every direction. The coming imperial universe, blind to meaning, is filled by the multifarious totality of the production of subjectivity. The decline is no longer a future destiny, but the present reality of empire. America, America. The flight of European intellectuals to the United States was an attempt to rediscover a lost place. Was not American democracy in fact founded on the democracy of Exodus, on affirmative and non-dialectical values, and on pluralism and freedom? Did not these values, along with the notion of new frontiers, perpetually recreate the expansion of its democratic basis, beyond every abstract obstacle of the nation, ethnicity, and religion? This music was played at times in a high form in the project of Pax Americana, proclaimed by the liberal leadership, and at times in a low form, represented by the American dream of social mobility and equal opportunity for wealth and freedom for every honest person. In short, the American way of life. The New Deal's project to surmount the world crisis in the 1930s, which was so different from, and so much more liberal, than the European political and cultural projects to respond to the crisis, supported this conception of the American ideal. When Hannah Arendt claimed the American Revolution to be superior to the French because the American was an unlimited search for political freedom, and the French a limited struggle over scarcity and inequality, she not only celebrated an ideal of freedom that Europeans no longer knew, but also re-territorialized it in the United States. In a certain sense, then, it seemed as if the continuity that had existed between U.S. history and the history of Europe was broken, and that the United States had embarked on a different course. But really, the United States represented for these Europeans the resurrection of an idea of freedom that Europe had lost. From the standpoint of a Europe in crisis, the United States, Jefferson's Empire of Liberty, represented the renewal of the imperial idea. The great 19th century American writers had sung the epic dimensions of the freedom of the new continent. In Whitman, naturalism became affirmative, and in Melville, realism became desiring. An American place is territorialized in the name of a constitution of freedom, and at the same time, continually deterritorialized through the opening of frontiers and exodus. The great American philosophers, from Emerson to Whitehead and Pierce, opened up Hegelianism, or really, the apologia of imperialist Europe, to the spiritual currents of a process that was new and immense, determinate and unlimited. The Europeans in crisis were enchanted by the siren songs of a new empire. European Americanism and anti-Americanism in the 20th century are both manifestations of the difficult relationship between Europeans in crisis and the U.S. imperial project. The American utopia was received in many different ways, but it functioned everywhere in 20th century Europe as a central reference point. The continuous preoccupation was manifest both in the spleen of the crisis and in the spirit of the avant-garde. In other words, through the self-destruction of modernity and the indeterminate but uncontainable will to innovation that drove the last wave of great European cultural movements, from expressionism and futurism to cubism and abstractionism. The military history of the double rescue of Europe by the U.S. armies in the two world wars was paralleled by a rescue in political and cultural terms. American hegemony over Europe, which was founded on financial, economic, and military structures, was made to seem natural through a series of cultural and ideological operations. Consider, for example, how in the years surrounding the end of World War II, the locus of artistic production and the idea of modern art shifted from Paris to New York. Serge Guilbeault recounts the fascinating story of how, when the Paris art scene had been thrown into disarray by war and Nazi occupation, and in the midst of an ideological campaign to promote the leading role of the United States in the post-war world, the abstract expressionism of New York artists, such as Jackson Pollock and Robert Motherwell, was established as a natural continuation and heir of European, and specifically Parisian modernism. New York stole the idea of modern art. Quote, American art was thus described as a logical culmination of a long-standing and inexorable tendency toward abstraction. Once American culture was raised to the status of an international model, the significance of what was specifically American had to change. What had been characteristically American now became representative of Western culture as a whole. In this way, American art was transformed from regional to international art, and then to universal art. In this respect, post-war American culture was placed on the same footing as American economic and military strength. It was made responsible for the survival of democratic liberties in the free world. End quote. This passage in the history of artistic production, and more important, art criticism, is simply one aspect of the multifaceted ideological operation that cast a U.S. global hegemony as a natural and ineluctable consequence of the crisis of Europe. Paradoxically, even the ferocious European nationalisms, which had led to such violent conflicts over the first half of the century, were eventually displaced by a competition over who could better express a strong Americanism. Lenin's Soviet Union, in fact, may have heard the siren song of Americanism most clearly. The challenge was to replicate the results of the capitalism that had achieved its pinnacle in the United States. The Soviets argued against the means the United States employed and claimed instead that socialism could attain the same results more efficiently through hard labor and the sacrifice of freedom. This terrible ambiguity also runs throughout Gramsci's writings on Americanism and Fordism, one of the fundamental texts for understanding the American problem from the European point of view. Gramsci saw the United States, with its combination of new Taylorist forms of the organization of labor and its powerful capitalist will to dominate, as the inevitable reference point for the future. It was the only path for development. For Gramsci, it was then a matter of understanding whether the revolution would be active, like that of Soviet Russia, or passive, as in fascist Italy. The consonance between Americanism and state socialism should be obvious, with their parallel paths of development on the two sides of the Atlantic throughout the Cold War, which led finally to dangerous competitions over space exploration and nuclear weapons. These parallel paths simply highlight the fact that a certain Americanism had penetrated into the heart of even its strongest adversary. The 20th century developments of Russia were to a certain extent a microcosm for those of Europe. The refusal of European consciousness to recognize its decline often took the form of projecting its crisis onto the American utopia. That projection continued for a long as long as lasted the necessity and urgency to rediscover a site of freedom that could continue the teleological vision of which Hegelian historicism is perhaps the highest expression. The paradoxes of this projection multiplied, to the point where European consciousness, faced with its undeniable and irreversible decline, reacted by going to the other extreme. The primary set of competition, which had affirmed and repeated the formal power of the U.S. utopia, now represented its complete overturning. Solzhenitsyn's Russia became the absolute negative of the most caricatural and apologetic images of the U.S. utopia in the guise of Arnold Toynbee. It should come as no surprise that the ideologies of the end of history, which are as evolutionary as they are postmodern, should appear to complete this ideological mess. The American empire will bring an end to history. We know, however, that this idea of American empire as a redemption of utopia is completely illusory. First of all, the coming empire is not American, and the United States is not its center. The fundamental principle of empire, as we've described it throughout this book, is that its power has no actual and localizable terrain or center. Imperial power is distributed in networks, through mobile and articulated mechanisms of control. This is not to say that the U.S. government and the U.S. territory are no different from any other. The United States certainly occupies a privileged position in the global segmentations and hierarchies of empire. As the powers and boundaries of nation-states decline, however, differences between national territories become increasingly relative. They are now not differences of nature, as were, for example, the differences between the territory of the metropole and that of the colony, but differences of degree. Furthermore, the United States cannot rectify or redeem the crisis and decline of empire. The United States is not the place where the European or even the modern subject can flee to resolve its uneasiness and unhappiness. There is no such place. The means to get beyond the crisis is the ontological displacement of the subject. The most important change, therefore, takes place inside humanity, since, with the end of modernity, also ends the hope of finding someone that can identify the self outside the community, outside cooperation, and outside the critical and contradictory relationships that each person finds in a non-place, that is, in the world and the multitude. This is where the idea of empire reappears, not as a territory, not in the determinate dimensions of its time and space, and not from the standpoint of a people and its history, but rather simply as a fabric of an ontological human dimension that tends to become universal. Crisis, post-modernization, and the passage to empire involve a real convergence of the realms that used to be designated as base and superstructure. Empire takes form when language and communication, or really, when immaterial labor and cooperation, become the dominant productive force. The superstructure is put to work, and the universe we live in is a universe of productive linguistic networks. The lines of production and those of representation cross and mix in the same linguistic and productive realm. In this context, the distinctions that define the central categories of political economy tend to blur. Production becomes indistinguishable from reproduction. Productive forces merge with relations of production. Constant capital tends to be constituted and represented within variable capital in the brains, bodies, and cooperation of productive subjects. Social subjects are at the same time producers and products of this unitary machine. In this new historical formation, it is thus no longer possible to identify a sign, a subject, a value, or a practice that is outside. The formation of this totality, however, does not eliminate exploitation. It rather redefines it, primarily in relation to communication and cooperation. Exploitation is the expropriation of cooperation and the nullification of meanings of linguistic production. Consequently, resistances to command continually emerge within empire. Antagonisms to exploitation are articulated across the global networks of production and determine crises on each and every node. Crisis is coextensive with the postmodern totality of capitalist production. It is proper to imperial control. In this respect, the decline and fall of empire is defined not as a diachronic movement, but as a synchronic reality. Crisis runs through every moment of the development and recomposition of the totality. With the real subsumption of society under capital, social antagonisms can erupt as conflict in every moment and on every term of communicative production and exchange. Capital has become a world. Use value and all other references to values and processes of valorization that were conceived to be outside the capitalist mode of production have progressively vanished. Subjectivity is entirely immersed in exchange and language, but that does not mean it's now pacific. Technological development based on the generalization of the communicative relationships of production is a motor of crisis, and productive general intellect is a nest of antagonisms. Crisis and decline refer not to something external to empire, but to what is most internal. They pertain to the production of subjectivity itself, and thus they are at once proper and contrary to the processes of the reproduction of empire. Crisis and decline are not a hidden foundation, nor an ominous future, but a clear and obvious actuality, an always expected event, a latency that is always present. It is midnight in a night of specters, but the new reign of empire and the new immaterial and cooperative creativity of the multitude move in shadows, and nothing manages to illuminate our destiny ahead. Nonetheless, we have acquired a new point of reference, and tomorrow perhaps a new consciousness, which consists in the fact that empire is defined by crisis, that its decline has already begun, and that consequently every line of antagonism leads toward the event and singularity. What does it mean practically that crisis is imminent to and indistinguishable from empire? Is it possible in this dark night to theorize positively and define a practice of the event? Generation. Two central impediments prevent us from responding to these questions immediately. The first is presented by the overbearing power of bourgeois metaphysics, and specifically, the widely propagated illusion that the capitalist market and the capitalist regime of production are eternal and insuperable. The bizarre naturalness of capitalism is a pure and simple mystification, and we have to disabuse ourselves of it right away. The second impediment is represented by the numerous theoretical positions that see no alternative to the present form of rule except a blind anarchic other, and that thus partake in a mysticism of the limit. From this ideological perspective, the suffering of existence cannot manage to be articulated, become conscious, and establish a standpoint of revolt. This theoretical position leads merely to a cynical attitude and quietistic practices. The illusion of the naturalness of capitalism and the radicality of the limit actually stand in a relationship of complementarity. Their complicity is expressed in an exhausting powerlessness. The fact is that neither of these positions, neither the apologetic one nor the mystical one, manages to grasp the primary aspect of biopolitical order, its productivity. They cannot interpret the virtual powers of the multitude that tend constantly toward becoming possible and real. In other words, they have lost track of the fundamental productivity of being. We can answer the question of how to get out of the crisis only by lowering ourselves down into biopolitical virtuality, enriched by the singular and creative processes of the production of subjectivity. How are rupture and innovation possible, however, in the absolute horizon in which we are immersed? In a world in which values seem to have been negated in a vacuum of meaning and a lack of any measure. Here, we do not need to go back again to a description of desire and its ontological excess, nor insist again on the dimension of the beyond. It is sufficient to point to the generative determination of desire and thus its productivity. In effect, the complete commingling of the political, the social, and the economic, and the constitution of the present reveals a biopolitical space that, much better than Hannah Arendt's nostalgic utopia political space, explains the ability of desire to confront the crisis. The entire conceptual horizon is thus completely redefined. The biopolitical, seen from the standpoint of desire, is nothing other than concrete production, human collectivity in action. Desire appears here as productive space, as the actuality of human cooperation in the construction of history. This production is purely and simply human reproduction, the power of generation. Desiring production is generation, or rather, the excess of labor and the accumulation of a power incorporated into the collective movement of singular essences, both its cause and its completion. When our analysis is firmly situated in the biopolitical world, where social, economic, and political production and reproduction coincide, the ontological perspective and the anthropological perspective tend to overlap. Empire pretends to be the master of that world because it can destroy it. What a horrible illusion. In reality, we are masters of the world because our desire and labor regenerate it continuously. The biopolitical world is an inexhaustible weaving together of generative actions, of which the collective, as meeting point of singularities, is the motor. No metaphysics, except a delirious one, can pretend to define humanity as isolated and powerless. No ontology, except a transcendent one, can relegate humanity to individuality. No anthropology, except a pathological one, can define humanity as a negative power. Generation, that first fact of metaphysics, ontology, and anthropology, is a collective mechanism or apparatus of desire. Biopolitical becoming celebrates this first dimension in absolute terms. Political theory is forced by this new reality to redefine itself radically. In biopolitical society, for example, fear cannot be employed, as Thomas Hobbes proposed, as the exclusive motor of the contractual constitution of politics, thus negating the love of the multitude. Or rather, in biopolitical society, the decision of the sovereign can never negate the desire of the multitude. If those founding modern strategies of sovereignty were employed today, with the oppositions they determine, the world would come to a halt, because generation would no longer be possible. For generation to take place, the political has to yield to love and desire, and that is to the fundamental forces of biopolitical production. The political is not what we are taught it is today by the cynical Machiavellianism of politicians. It is, rather, as the democratic Machiavelli tells us, the power of generation, desire, and love. Political theory has to reorient itself along these lines and assume the language of generation. Generation is the primum of the biopolitical world of empire. Biopower, a horizon of the hybridization of the natural and the artificial, needs and machines, desire, and the collective organization of the economic and the social, must continually regenerate itself in order to exist. Generation is there, before all else, as basis and motor of production and reproduction. The generative connection gives meaning to communication, and any model of everyday philosophical or political communication that does not respond to this primacy is false. The social and political relationships of empire register this phase of the development of production and interpret the generative and productive biosphere. We have thus reached a limit of the virtuality of the real subsumption of productive society under capital. But precisely on this limit, the possibility of generation and the collective force of desire are revealed in all their power. Corruption. Opposed to generation stands corruption. Far from being the necessary complement of generation, as the various Platonic currents of philosophy would like, corruption is merely its symbol negation. Corruption breaks a chain of desire and interrupts its extension across the biopolitical horizon of production. It constructs black holes and ontological vacuums in the life of the multitude that not even the most perverse political science manages to camouflage. Corruption, contrary to desire, is not an ontological motor, but simply the lack of ontological foundation of the biopolitical practices of being. In empire, corruption is everywhere. It is the cornerstone and keystone of domination. It resides in different forms in the supreme government of empire and its vassal administrations. The most refined and the most rotten administrative police forces, the lobbies of the ruling classes, the mafias of rising social groups, the churches and sects, the perpetrators and persecutors of scandal, the great financial conglomerates, and everyday economic transactions. Through corruption, imperial power extends a smokescreen across the world, and command over the multitude is exercised in this putrid cloud, in the absence of light and truth. It is no mystery how we recognize corruption and how we identify the powerful emptiness of the mist of indifference that imperial power extends across the world. In fact, the ability to recognize corruption is, to use a phrase of Descartes, the most widely shared faculty in the world. Corruption is easily perceived because it appears immediately as a form of violence, as an insult, and indeed, it is an insult. Corruption is in fact the sign of the impossibility of linking power to value, and its denunciation is thus a direct intuition of the lack of being. Corruption is what separates a body and a mind from what they can do, since knowledge and existence in the biopolitical world always consists in the production of value. This lack of being appears as a wound, a death wish of the socius, a stripping away of being from the world. The forms in which corruption appears are so numerous that trying to list them is like pouring the sea into a teacup. Let us try nonetheless to give a few examples, even though they can in no way serve to represent the whole. In the first place, there is corruption's individual choice that is opposed to and violates the fundamental community and solidarity defined by biopolitical production. This small everyday violence of power is a mafia-style corruption. In the second place, there is corruption of the productive order, or really exploitation. This includes the fact that the values that derive from the collective cooperation of labor are expropriated, and what was in the biopolitical ab origine public is privatized. Capitalism is completely implicated in this corruption and privatization. As St. Augustine says, the great reigns are only the enlarged projections of little thieves. Augustine of Hippo, however, so realistic in this pessimistic conception of power, would be struck dumb by today's little thieves of monetary and financial power. Really, when capitalism loses its relationship to value, both as a measure of individual exploitation and as a norm of collective progress, it appears immediately as corruption. The increasingly abstract sequence of its functioning, from the accumulation of surplus value to monetary and financial speculation, is shown to be a powerful march toward generalized corruption. If capitalism is by definition a system of corruption, held together nonetheless, as in Mondeville's fable, by its cooperative cleverness, and are deemed according to all its ideologies on right and left by its progressive function, then when measure is dissolved and the progressive telos breaks down, nothing essential remains of capitalism but corruption. In the third place, corruption appears in the functioning of ideology, or rather, in the perversion of the senses of linguistic communication. Here, corruption touches on the biopolitical realm, attacking its productive nodes and obstructing its generative processes. This attack is demonstrated in the fourth place, when the practices of imperial government, the threat of terror becomes a weapon to resolve limited or regional conflicts, and an apparatus for imperial development. Imperial command, in this case, is disguised, and can alternately appear as corruption or destruction, almost as if to reveal the profound call that the former makes for the latter, and the latter for the former. The two dance together over the abyss, over the imperial lack of being. Such examples of corruption could be multiplied ad infinitum. But at the base of all these forms of corruption, there's an operation of ontological nullification that is defined and exercised as a destruction of the singular essence of the multitude. The multitude must be unified or segmented into different unities. This is how the multitude has to be corrupted. This is why the ancient and modern concepts of corruption cannot be translated directly into the postmodern concept. Whereas in ancient and modern times, corruption was defined in relation to the schemas and or relations of value, and demonstrated as a falsification of them in such a way that it could at times play a role in the change among the forms of government and the restoration of values. Today, in contrast, corruption cannot play a role in any transformation of the forms of government, because corruption itself is the substance and totality of empire. Corruption is the pure exercise of command, without any proportionate or adequate reference to the world of life. It is command directed toward the destruction of the singularity of the multitude through its coercive unification and or cruel segmentation. This is why empire necessarily declines in the very moment of its rise. This negative figure of command over productive biopower is even more paradoxical when viewed from the perspective of corporeality. Biopolitical generation directly transforms the bodies of the multitude. These are, as we have seen, bodies enriched with intellectual and cooperative power, and bodies that are already hybrid. What generation offers us in postmodernity are thus bodies beyond measure. In this context, corruption appears simply as disease, frustration, and mutilation. This is how power has always acted against enriched bodies. Corruption also appears as psychosis, opiates, anguish, and boredom. But this, too, has always happened throughout modernity and disciplinary societies. The specificity of corruption today is instead the rupture of the community of singular bodies and the impediment to its action, a rupture of the productive biopolitical community and an impediment to its life. Here we are thus faced with a paradox. Empire recognizes and profits from the fact that in cooperation, bodies produce more, and in community, bodies enjoy more. But it has to obstruct and control this cooperative autonomy so as not to be destroyed by it. Corruption operates to impede this going beyond measure of the bodies through community. This singular universalization of the new power bodies, which threaten the very existence of empire. The paradox is irresolvable. The more the world becomes rich, the more empire, which is based on this wealth, must negate the conditions of the production of wealth. Our task is to investigate how ultimately corruption can be forced to cede its control to generation.